Yes.
Okay, so we're coming back from the Passover holiday, continuing the new series about morality and bioethics. We've covered the 7 Noahide laws, which I believe is somewhat related to this series. That is why I included it. And last lecture was about, can one be ethical, an ethical individual without belief in God? Tonight is somewhat of a continuation of that lecture, and you will be surprised what I called it. I called the lecture, I was only following orders, or as it's known, the Nuremberg defense. Some of you perhaps are not familiar with what or where Nuremberg is, and throughout the lecture you will hear more about it. The topic, however, has more to do with the sanctity of life. And this topic is in some ways an introduction to other lectures that we'll be covering in this series, like euthanasia and abortion. Some of this information I'd like to credit to a very good book on the topic called Jewish Bioethics by Fred Rosner and Rabbi David Bleich, who did a beautiful job in covering a lot of the pertinent areas that we need to contend with in this generation, topics that have come about as a result of medicine, advances in the medicine field, and issues that have been debated for a long, long time. There's obviously a Jewish perspective to all of this, and that's what this book covers. Nonetheless, a lot of it is relevant to those who simply want to do things morally correct. So the information that is found in this book is of great relevance, and a lot of thanks goes to the many contributors who contributed towards this book, the many sources, the research that has been done, the studies, and that is why I think it's a very good source of information for those who want to delve a little bit deeper into this area. One of the questions that we raised in the last lecture was about conflicts between two types of ethics: one's own morality, one's own ethical beliefs, and perhaps the ethics of his job. So we did say that this presents a problem, that sometimes there will be a conflict between two philosophies or two types of beliefs, both being ethical, different kinds of ethics. What we did not answer is, what are we going to do about it? How does one deal with conflicts in ethics? Conflict between two different types of moralities. Apparently, this is something that happens from time to time, and there's no clear answer as to what to do. We're coming from a totally different perspective. We believe in divine law. We have a Torah. And the Torah spells out pretty much, most of the time, what one needs to do. That which is not clear to us from the Torah, we look for answers in the Talmud, in the Gemara, in Halakha. Sometimes it's difficult. There are complex situations, and we need to look at all the sources possible to arrive at the best solution to a particular problem. And sometimes there could be various opinions. That's okay, that's acceptable, but in the end we need to arrive at a consensus. Ultimately, a consensus is very important because we need to know what to do. And as you will see, there are various issues that are not so simple, that people are dealing with today much more than in the past. And they're uncertain as to what to do. And I'll cover some of them briefly throughout the lecture. The question, however, is for the average human being, without Torah, without belief in a divine law, how is he supposed to know what to do? What is the right thing to do when there's a conflict? The first and foremost idea the man has to have clarity of is that he is to blame. He is the source of all the confusion. Man has conflicts within himself. And those conflicts, we've already explained in the past, have to do with the soul and the physical body. Each one has a different agenda, different needs. Man, therefore, is full of contradictions, you may say. Man does not know himself good enough. He's not very familiar with his weaknesses. And because of that, because man does not have clarity, that is why we've had many philosophies in the past. Many philosophies, different kinds of ideas have been espoused, have been expressed, because people feel differently about many, many things. A lack of clarity. I want to just mention two camps, two philosophical camps, two ways of thinking that are quite prominent, quite known for those who study philosophy, and that is the camp of rationalism versus empiricism. The camp who is more of a rationalist believes that reason alone can explain the world. Reason alone can explain life. Reason alone can explain a lot about ourselves. In other words, using reason, using logic. Whereas empiricism says no, it's through the sensory experience. Sensory experience that we are able to determine whatever it is that we know. That is where the word empirical evidence comes from, which is also the scientific way of looking at things. We look at evidence. That which is empirical, that which we experience with our senses, that is real for us. The reason alone, the mind alone, cannot come up with the truth, cannot come up with the real perception. It's only after we experience something that we can know it. A philosopher who lived in the 18th century, a famous philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, famous philosopher, decided to make order between these two camps. That's the way I explain what he attempted to do. He was a very bright individual, and he composed many books about his thoughts about various things. And he pretty much said as follows: ultimately, the bottom line, everything has to go through the mind. Whether you experience it, whether it's knowledge that somehow you have from beforehand, as we call it a priori, regardless of what knowledge you have or what experiences you had, all of that has to ultimately go through the mind. The mind is the one that has to look at all of it, analyze all of it, and come up with knowledge, come up with whatever it believes to be true. So in the end, he credits the mind. He says the mind is the one that's responsible for figuring things out. Again, regardless of whether there is a priori knowledge or whether it's something that we experience, the two in the end have to go through the mind. The mind is the one that's going to be responsible for figuring things out. So he claims that the mind is capable, to an extent, to figure things out. In the end, it is the one that figures things out. However, when it comes to morality, there seems to be agreement, not only in what he says and what he wrote, but in other camps as well, and many, many cultures, that there is a certain a priori moral perception of certain things. In other words, the mind, not necessarily through logic, but somehow the mind knows on its own right from wrong. And I've covered that a little bit in the past when we said that the basics man knows. Now again, the Jewish people come from the perspective of that we have a divine soul, and the soul is the one that knows these things. We are cognizant of certain things because of our conscience. And that conscience is from God. That conscience is from the soul. But in the end, there's general agreement, even among those who are not Jewish, that there's certain a priori moral perceptions for which there is agreement. Now, moral perceptions can be divided. There's all kinds of perceptions. Some of them are imperative, meaning that they're necessary, they're very important. An example would be kibud avayim, honoring one's parent. Another example would be telling the truth. These are called morally imperative. In other words, as we divide or categorize morality, we will find that there's different levels of them. Some are recommended, some are pretty much imperative, meaning that we need to have them. We all agree that they're very important. Some are commendable, like charity, philanthropy. It's not imperative, but it's commendable. It's the right thing to do. So pretty much there's agreement on all of this. Then there is an area that is neutral, morally neutral. I don't know how much the following example can fit into this category, but I would perhaps suggest even hunting for whales, overdoing it, especially when we're dealing with a species that is near extinction. Some people don't care. They say, well, this brings in money, it's a good business, it's lucrative. And that is why you have people still hunting rhinoceros just for the horn. They don't care about the whole meat, about the animal. Or hunting tigers. There's not a lot of them. So you could say that this is something neutral. What does neutral mean? That it doesn't really have any moral significance. Actually, this would be more perhaps of something that some individuals would say that it's totally not right. But I'm calling it morally neutral because it may not have so much moral significance. Perhaps another example would be alcohol. As long as you don't overdo it, somebody says, go ahead and drink alcohol, or some society that prohibits alcohol. It doesn't really have any moral significance. It's neutral. It's not something that necessarily we think is very important to enact a law for it, whether it's prohibiting or promoting it. It's just neutral. You have that which is morally odious. Odious means that people do not approve of. People do not accept as being correct. Actually, this is a better example of something that perhaps does damage to the environment. Something that people pretty much in general would not approve of. Then you have that which is morally prescribed. Morally prescribed meaning that which is condemned, that which people believe is evil. And that's not to kill. As you can see, you have various categories of different types of morality, some of which everybody approves of, some of which people do not approve of, some of it which is prescribed, in other words, totally unacceptable, some which is people don't like, odious, but it's not prohibited. Right? Various levels that you can divide the different types of morality. Even though this to us is simple, even though we can see more or less the various categories of morality, sometimes it's not black and white. Sometimes it's not so clear. Let's take an example of a father who asks his son for cigarettes. And he's suffering from emphysema. What should the son do? There is a commandment to honor one's parent, but here his father is hurting himself by smoking. What should you do? So it's not so clear. It's not black and white what you should do. Therefore, it's not enough that we have a system of morals and ethics. What's very important is, in addition to having a system of morals and ethics, is to organize them in hierarchical order. Which one is more important, which one is less important? You have to have that. Otherwise, we're back to square one, to the original problem question. What do we do with the conflict? You see? So not only is it important to have a system of morals and ethics, it's very important to also have a hierarchical order of which one is on top, which one's at the bottom, which one is more important, which one is less important. For example, the question that arises many times, and we will be discussing it, is, does commitment to the preservation of life preclude the liberty to commit suicide? On the one hand, that is what we're talking about. We'll be talking about the sanctity of life, preserving life, right? Does that preclude the liberty to commit suicide? We all believe in people having certain liberties, people wanting to be happy. Perhaps that's the way he's going to be happy. He's suffering, he's in pain. So does the sanctity of life or the commitment of preserving life preclude the liberty to commit suicide? In other words, is one more important than the other one? Does one basically eliminate the possibility of the other? This will be the question that we will be discussing somewhat when we cover the topics of euthanasia and abortion. Euthanasia is for those people who are very, very sick, and according to the doctors, there's no chance of full recovery. And perhaps we may be doing them a favor by disconnecting them from the machines. This is a question that comes up a lot. Sometimes children do not know what to do. To disconnect, that means to indirectly bring about the individual's death. It's not so simple. So you will hear all kinds of opinions. They're suffering, they're in pain, it's the right thing, it's good for them. Unless you have instructions from them, and even then, even if you have instructions from them, according to the Jewish view, according to Allah, it's not so simple. What can you do and what you cannot do? We have guidelines that are dictated by halakha as to what is permissible and what is not. How much do we have to go out of our way to save a person's life? If they're almost on the throes of death, they're about to die anyway. What about preserving the life of a lunatic? He's just hurting himself. He's causing a lot of harm to himself and to others. Perhaps, maybe we shouldn't bother with him, right? Shouldn't make that much of an effort. But again, it's human life. How do we treat him? So can you see how sometimes there are certain dilemmas, ethical, moral dilemmas, or conflicts between what is right and what is wrong? Thank God we're fortunate that the Torah pretty much clarifies to us through the various commandments, the various instructions, what is right and what is wrong. We have various examples in the Torah and in the Talmud that help greatly in trying to decipher, trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. So let me take, for example, the commandment that we will be reading soon in the Torah, in Parshat Kedoshim. Ish avi ve'imo tirau ve'shabetotai tishmoru. Fear your father and your mother. In other words, respect, fear them. However, observe my Sabbath. What does one have to do with the other? Why place the two commandments in one verse? Honoring one's parent we know is of supreme importance. We know that from Aseret HaDibrot, from the Ten Commandments. Shabbat is mentioned many times in the Torah. The sanctity of Shabbat, observe the Shabbat. Don't desecrate the Shabbat. Why put them together in the same verse, in the same pasuk? So the rabbis explain that this was intentional. The Torah wants to remind us that even if you're supposed to fear your father, you're supposed to show proper respect to your parent, nonetheless, if that parent tells you to transgress, to commit a sin, to do something on the Sabbath which is prohibited, to desecrate the Sabbath, you don't listen to that parent. Et shabbatotai tishmoru. In other words, even though I told you to honor your father and mother, to respect them, to fear them, but you have to respect my Sabbath. Who said so? Ani Hashem Elokechem, the verse continues on to say. It's me, God, who's telling you to do this. What does that have to do with anything? It's obviously that God is telling us to do. No. The emphasis here of Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am your God telling this to you, is that you and your father are both obligated to do my will, to observe the Sabbath. Therefore, you cannot do it. In other words, you cannot do as your father says. You first have to observe my Shabbat. I wanted to perhaps add that perhaps another reason why Hashem says Ani Hashem Elokechem in this commandment is because there are times that a human being may be confronted with something which is really difficult for him to do. He loves his father, and he would very much want to do what he says. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm your father too, and I'm your father's father too. In other words, it may be difficult for you, but don't forget who's the real father, who gave you life. So sometimes the Torah needs to put greater emphasis on that and remind us of who comes first, what comes first. Then there's another one. Et shabbatotai tishmoru v'et mikdashi tirau. Observe my Sabbath, but fear my sanctuary. In other words, be respectful of my sanctuary, whether it's the tabernacle or later on the Bet HaMikdash, the temple. What does one have to do with the other? The rabbis explain the two are in the same verse to teach us an important rule, a halacha. En binyan Bet HaMikdash docha et HaShabbat. The building of the Bet HaMikdash is not done at the expense of the Shabbat. Shabbat is not for building. I would think to build a holy temple is so important, I can do it any day of the week, even on the Shabbat. No. Even though it's true, it's an important task, the building of a temple, but not on the Shabbat. So the Torah places the two in one verse, in one pasuk. In other words, observe my Shabbat, but fear my Mikdash. What does that mean? In other words, yes, you fear the Mikdash, you think the Bet HaMikdash, the temple is very important. You're right, but don't forget, not at the expense of Shabbat. We would not do this on our own. We would not know this. We would think of building a temple, especially since sacrifices used to be brought on Shabbat too. I would think maybe this is permissible. This is an exception. No, not at the expense of Shabbat. Some very famous examples in the Gemara that are very important for us to understand are as follows. There's one incident, well, it's an example of two individuals who are walking in the desert, and one of them has a jar of water with him, and there's no water around, and they both realize that if they share this water, they will not make it to a settlement where there's water. They will both die from thirst. If one of them drinks it, he will survive. Somehow they calculate that there's enough water for one individual to survive. What do? Obviously the water here in this example belongs to one individual. So the Gemara is very clear. Chayecha kodmim lechayecha v'recha. Rabbi Akiva says, your life comes first. These Gemarot, this one and the next one that I'm going to share with you, are very important because they relate to all kinds of situations in life. So this important ruling of your life comes first is significant. In other words, you can't just belittle yourself. You can't just throw away your life. even though in some situations you're allowed to give somebody else the chance to live at your expense. But I'm not going to get into that. Generally speaking, Rabbi Akiva had to tell us over here what is morally right. Should we just share? Well, what are you going to accomplish by sharing? You're both going to die. But what if there's a chance that they may both survive? We don't know for sure that they both will die. You see now how it becomes a little bit more complicated? Do I have to take a chance? See? So we need this reminder of your life comes first, even though there is a possibility that you both can survive. Otherwise, why not take a chance? But then there's another example. What if somebody tells an individual, listen, go get me this individual, go get me this guy. If you don't get him, you're going to die. Hand him over to me. What should he do? In that example, the rabbis tell us, "My hazard, the damach sumak tfei." Whoever told you that your blood is redder than that individual's blood? Who says that you are entitled to live and not the other individual? Who made you the judge here to decide that go ahead and bring him over, hand him over, so that you can stay alive? Here, the two are in equal danger, pretty much. Either this individual dies, or the one that he hands over to the authorities. So what should you do? There you can't say, me first, my life comes first. The two are in equal danger. Your blood is not redder than the other individual's blood. This, of course, has ramifications in all kinds of situations too. But since this is not too common today, I'd rather discuss another one that is a little bit much more experienced in situations where a person needs your help and you can offer that help and no harm will come your way. The Torah says, Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. Do not stand by idly when you see your brother drowning. You can help him. You can easily help him. You know how to swim. Save him. Now there are all kinds of situations and all kinds of examples where this applies. I just gave one example of saving his life by jumping into the water. But what about if you don't know how to swim? You don't have to endanger yourself. Or do you? How much should you endanger yourself? What if there's a 50-50 chance that you may not survive? Does that commandment still apply? When the Torah says, don't stand by while you can help your brother, does that mean always do something? Or does it mean not at your own expense? And I'm not talking about financial expense here, because financial expense, you're supposed to use your money, to save another individual's life. But if this means that your life will be in danger, then you don't have to do it. What about then donating a kidney? You see how this is relevant? This happens all the time. Should you donate a kidney? You have two. Nothing will happen if you're left with one. Usually not. I think from all the studies and all the experience that surgeons have in this area, they've pretty much concluded that there's very little risk for the donor to give a kidney. Now the other individual, well, that will depend on whether it takes or it does not take. He may need medication all his life, but it may save his life. So obviously they're going to do all the checks to see if they're compatible or not, but this would be a worthy cause. Does he have to do it? Or can he do it? Should he do it? You see where the question lies? In how much of an obligation do we have? On the one hand, we just finished saying that there is a commandment, Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha, don't stand by and do nothing. Well, you're a relative, and you feel more obligated to do so. But are you really obligated? The answer is no. Because you're getting rid of a part of your body. Even though you may survive, it still may affect you one way or another. And even if it does not affect you, you're not obligated to do it. Is it a good thing to do? Is it a mitzvah, a good deed? The answer is yes, if you can, if you want to. And this, of course, could be a lifesaver to the other individual. You can spare him dialysis for the rest of his life. And people have done that successfully. But as you can see, these are the kinds of questions that arise. There are many, many areas in life that we don't even realize, that present all kinds of dilemmas. We are fortunate that we have, most of the time, the halakha to guide us as to what is right and what is an obligation and what is not. But what do we see so far from all of this? That acceptance of the sanctity of life is self-evident, an a priori value. Sanctity of life is, in many cultures, accepted as an a priori value. It is something that people recognize. Life is sanctified. Life has value. Life is not something to be taken so lightly. It's not something that is disposable. It's therefore an a priori value. It's something that we on our own accept as self-evident. Was that always the case? No. If you look back in history, it was not always the case. People did not always treat life with the sanctity that it really deserves. And one of the best recent examples is World War I. In World War I, you also had two sides fighting each other. And you had the losers, the Axis powers, the ones who were in charge of that side, tried in court for their war crimes. And what was their excuse? Superior orders. We were following orders from our superiors. And in World War I, they accepted that excuse. That was sufficient to absolve them of any crimes that they committed. Big surprise came in World War II. No more. They threw it out. Even though in World War II, the Nazis, especially those in high positions of power, were tried in the famous Nuremberg trials. Many of them pretty much said, nicht schuldig. You know, I'm not guilty. Why? Because of the famous, I guess, German expression that they use, Befehl ist Befehl. The law or the order is an order. In other words, I was just following orders. In other words, they were trying to say, I didn't believe in this. I didn't want this, which is not true, of course. From reading the proceedings, I came to the conclusion, I believe, that they really did investigate if a particular individual accepted this philosophy, it was the Nazi philosophy, or he was really against it and really was opposed to all of it all along and really had a hard time with it, struggled with it. And if he could have, he would not have done what he's being accused of doing. To some extent, they did. I mean, that's what a court is. That's what a trial is all about, is to figure out, you know, as much as possible, what was going on in their mind, what did they actually do, what was under their control. But in general, that excuse was thrown out of court, was not accepted. They obviously understood things a little bit differently. And what did they say? They said that obedience of the law is not sufficient justification for killing at the time of war. I was just trying to obey the law. They actually instituted various principles in Nuremberg. Principle number 4, Nuremberg principle number 4 reads The fact that a person acted pursuant to orders of his government does not relieve him from responsibility of international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him. He had a moral choice to disobey the law. And that's what they concluded. They all concluded in the proceedings of the Nuremberg trials that there is a moral obligation to disobey an unjust law. In other words, not only is there no obligation to follow orders, there's actually a moral obligation to disobey an unjust law. If you know deep down that this law is clearly unjust, not right, you're obligated to defy it, to go against it, to oppose it, even though it's coming from your superiors. As we've explained many, many times, the human being has free will, and this is his chance to prove himself, to demonstrate what he believes in, what is important to him. Is he going to put up a fight, or is he going to go along with it? The life of another human being, just to snuff it out just like that, just because you're being told to do it. You know, it's not so simple. So thank God, during the Nuremberg trials, after World War II, there was pretty much consensus that this excuse of "I was following orders" is totally unacceptable, will not get you anywhere. Even though before, in the war times in history, well, this was accepted. You know, oh, I see. You were just, you know, we're not going to blame you for what your superiors told you to do. We're going to blame them, but not you. They came to the conclusion, no, that it's morally wrong to follow such orders. So what do we see? We see that pretty much, at least in this area, in certain matters, there is agreement between divine law and human conscience, which makes us conclude that man has been endowed by God with moral consciousness. For what purpose? To precisely know immediately God's will. In other words, God wants man to know what he wants of him. So he implanted in him this consciousness of certain things, certain basics. I mean, otherwise, as we've been saying all along, how should he know? Well, the soul knows. One's consciousness, one's conscience is aware of certain things. So basically, since divine law is pretty much in agreement with human consciousness, I mean, at least some people follow this kind of thinking. It tells us something about what is there from birth, what is there from the very beginning. Not something that we necessarily have to learn. It's something that is embedded in us, that we on our own should know. That this is God's will, that we preserve life. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk just a little bit about additional areas that the Torah discusses with regard to behavior. There is an area called V'asita tova yashar b'nei Hashem, that you should do that which is right, that which is good in the eyes of Hashem, of God. We learn various halachot from this, we learn various important points from this, that sometimes you have to do lifnim mishurat adin, beyond the letter of the law. Even though it's true the man owes you money. An example, he's poor. Perhaps, you should be a little bit more flexible with him and not insist on getting every penny from him. Reach a compromise with him. We're not talking about judges right now. A judge cannot have pity for the poor man. A judge needs to attempt to make a compromise before he knows what the rule is. And that is always the commendable thing to do, the proper thing to do, so that there should be peace between the two sides. But for an individual who is owed money, or in all kinds of other situations, there is a need to sometimes be flexible and not insist on having it your way. So under this category, V'asita tov v'yashar be'anei Hashem, many other halachot are included. Do what is right and correct in the eyes of Hashem. So if you know that something is not right 100%, even though there's no clear halakha, there's no clear commandment in the Torah telling you what to do. It's one of those gray areas. This commandment of doing what is right, what is good in the eyes of Hashem, is intended to cover those areas that are a little bit vague. Ask yourself, what would God say to this? What would He want me to do? And if one does do that, then hopefully he will do the right thing. There's another area, or another commandment I should say, that says, Ve'alachta bidrachav, and that you should follow or go in His ways, in God's ways, emulate Him. Or as they call it in Latin, imitat yodei, which other religions have adapted as well. What it means is, do as God would do. Just like He is compassionate, you be compassionate. Follow His ways. Emulate Him. Emulate His qualities. In other words, the way God interacts with this world. He's compassionate. He's merciful. He's benevolent. So, you don't have to necessarily insist on doing things in a very strict way. Consider the whole situation. Regardless of whether you are right or not, makes no difference. Perhaps this is an opportunity, a chance to be kind, to be soft. And you can get a lot further in life by having this kind of attitude than on insisting on always being right and then being stubborn, even though you're right. I always use the example of somebody driving down the main boulevard, and for him it's green. For the other gentleman, it's red. But that other gentleman is not stopping. Are you going to continue? It's my right of way. I'm right. Yeah, but don't be right. Be smart. Being smart is more important than being right. Do the smart thing, not necessarily the right thing. If a person always does what he believes to be right, he can get himself into a lot of trouble. He'll make a lot of enemies. But I was right. So you were not smart. Be smart. Do what is smart. And that takes, of course, some thought. But if one does follow this tzivui, this command of ve'alachta bidrachav, or ve'asita tov v'yashar be'anei Hashem, do what is right and correct in the eyes of God, it will help him. He will always consider, wait a minute, what does God want me to do in this kind of a situation? All right, so what we have so far is that man understands, or hopefully understands, the importance of moral conduct and ethics, and hopefully understands that there's a right and a wrong. Those who do not understand or cannot differentiate between right and wrong are called insane. Yes, insanity is not being able to differentiate between right and wrong. And sometimes that is used as an excuse in court. He's insane. He doesn't realize. He doesn't know better. But hopefully we should never have to come on to this kind of an excuse, because upstairs they know the truth. But man, nonetheless, even though he knows a lot and he has some clarity about everything and he does know right from wrong, he can still make mistakes. So, why do people make mistakes? Supposedly he has clarity, he's knowledgeable, he knows right from wrong, so why do mistakes happen? I put together a couple ideas, there may be more. One possibility, he simply did not learn, so he doesn't know everything. So he made a mistake because of ignorance. Number two, he was too quick to judge. Whether it's a situation at home between husband and wife, sometimes the men are too quick to judge, or the women. Don't judge so quickly. Listen to what has happened, analyze the situation, digest it, and then suggest something. But sometimes people are so quick to render judgment that they're totally mistaken. And sometimes those mistakes are very costly in relationships, difficult to repair. So many times mistakes come from pzizut, from impulsiveness. Number 3, maybe one is biased. And because he's biased, his judgment is faulty. He's not seeing objectively the situation. He's not seeing it properly because he's biased. He's a relative, right? He's related to the individual, or their friends, or all kinds of situations where he's being blinded for some reason. So that can cause a mistake. What else? Number 4, he doesn't have a very refined character. A person who does not have a refined character, he has all kinds of I guess we can call them character defects, whether it's anger or stubbornness. That can also impair his judgment. It may not enable him to see clearly or properly or fairly the situation because he's not refined. So when he sees something, he's seeing it in the wrong way because of his unrefined character. Number 5, his ideas, his opinions are not correct. Very simple. Why did he make a mistake? Because he's got everything wrong. In other words, he is not properly looking at a situation as a result of wrong ideas that he may have picked up in his youth. Maybe he was exposed to communism. And you know what he was taught? Your motherland comes first before your own parents. You know that kids snitched on their parents during a certain time in Russia? My father did this.
In Iran too.
In Iran too. The influence of the government was so powerful that it indoctrinated people with this kind of a belief that the motherland comes first, above everything else. So a person may have these kinds of de'ot, these kinds of beliefs that is not correct, simply not correct. Because now he makes many mistakes. Number 6, could be that he doesn't have all the details. If you really want to evaluate the situation, you want to suggest something, you want to give your opinion about it, you need to have all the facts. If you don't have all the facts, then you can make a mistake. You overlooked something. So that's another reason why mistakes happen. Get all the facts right. And number 7 is what I'd like to call ta'ut mishamayim. As David HaMelech says in Psalms, Shegiot miyavim ministarot nakeni. God, I don't know where these mistakes are happening, where they're coming from. Who understands the mistakes? Some things are hidden and beyond us. Mistakes happen for reasons that we don't know. It's from heaven. What's an example of a ta'ut mishamayim? In the Torah, there are various sacrifices that used to be brought for mistakes, for transgressions that were committed unintentionally. And there's an example of a nasi, of a king, of a leader, who committed an error, committed a mistake, a transgression, what his sacrifice needs to be. And the Torah says that when that happens, it's kilechol ha'am bishgaga. It means that everyone is at fault. Everyone's at fault. What is inferred from that is that if the head of the nation or one of its important leaders makes a mistake, which he should not have made because he knows better, nonetheless it still happened. You know why it happened? Because of the people. Because the people are not doing something right. And that behavior, that wrong behavior of the people is reflected in the leader making a mistake, because he represents them. The leader of the nation making a mistake, and it's a mistake that he should not have made, unintentional, committed a wrong and transgression, that's terrible. How could it happen? Shamayim. They made him forgetful for a moment. He forgot the ruling, he forgot the law, forgot the halakha. He did something against the Torah. Why? Because the people are not doing something right. And this is how it is brought to his attention. This is how it is brought to their attention as well. Look what happened to him. That means there's something wrong with what we're doing. The whole community is at fault. So how do we avoid mistakes? First of all, the human being needs to continuously remember that we're only human. No one is perfect. We all make mistakes from time to time. And because of that, one has to be very careful not to be arrogant and to remember continuously that we are accountable for what we do. And that one of these days, it won't be we who are judging, it will be God who will be judging us. So we need to therefore be careful how we judge others, how we look at others. So this constant awareness of our responsibility and of our weakness as human beings, hopefully will help us be a little bit more cautious. But this is not enough. We still, unfortunately, make mistakes from time to time for all kinds of reasons. So we need to pray. And this is something that a lot of people forget about. No matter how knowledgeable we are, no matter how much clarity we have, and even if we're humble, prayer is very important. And there are prayers that we say every day. Sheloi kashel, that I should not stumble. In other words, we pray to God, please help us that we not stumble. We don't want to stumble. That God should give us chokhmah, binah, v'da'at. We say that in the prayer too, that He should endow us with wisdom, with understanding, with the knowledge that we need. That we should be able to understand what needs to be understood, that we should have no doubts, that we should have the clarity we need to do things properly. And finally, that God should guide us in the proper path, and that He help us do what is right in His eyes, not what is right in our eyes. You see, the prayer needs to be in such a way where we're focused on what He wants of us, not what we want. A lot of trouble would be saved if people would not be thinking of what they want, what's in their best interest, but what He wants. Imagine a couple who's having a fight, who's having a disagreement about something. And they said, forget about what you want, forget about what I want. Let's find out what He wants. Wouldn't that be beautiful? We all have different wants, we all have different opinions about a lot of things. Why let that get carried away and cause all kinds of rifts and divisiveness in families because of things that are so silly and unimportant and vain? But this all comes from ignorance, from not understanding what's really important in life. A prayer reminds us that it's important to have a good relationship with God. If we strive to have a good relationship with God, then God willing, we will also succeed in having a good relationship with human beings.
Amen.